The first thing my stepmother said after the attorney closed the folder was, "Well, I guess blood doesn't always win after all." She said it while smoothing the front of her cream-colored dress, as if she'd already rehearsed the line in front of a mirror. We were standing in the great room of my grandfather's lake house, the one he had built with his own hands back in 1978, when he was still a young naval aviator with a new wife and a mortgage that terrified him. The tall windows behind her looked out over Lake Coeur d'Alene, and the September light was turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold. My stepbrother Marcus leaned against the stone fireplace with his hands in his pockets, trying not to smile. My father stood off to the side, holding a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched, and there I was, still wearing the black dress I'd bought 2 days ago for the funeral, my service cover tucked under my arm because I hadn't had time to change out of my Coast Guard uniform before driving in from Port Angeles. Then my stepmother turned to me and said, "Honey, we're going to need you out of the guest house by tomorrow morning. Marcus wants to use it as an office." My father added, quieter, almost like he was apologizing to the floorboards, "It's probably for the best, Claire." That was the moment my chest went hollow. Looking back, I should have expected it. I was 29 years old, a Coast Guard lieutenant, and I'd seen enough of human behavior during rescues off the Washington coast to know that grief and greed travel in the same boat. But there's something about being told to leave a house that smells like your grandfather's pipe tobacco less than 4 hours after you buried him that makes the military training slip right off your shoulders. I didn't say anything. I just nodded once, the way you nod when a senior officer gives an order you hate. But before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand who my grandfather was and why the 3 people in that room had no idea what they had just done. My grandfather's name was Captain Edward Easy Lindquist, and he was 87 when the stroke took him on a Tuesday morning in his garden. He had flown A-4 Skyhawks off the USS Oriskany during 2 tours in Vietnam, and when he came home, he built a life on that lake the same careful way he rebuilt old engines, with patience and a deep suspicion of shortcuts. He raised my father alone after my grandmother died of ovarian cancer in 1984. My father was 9. And when my own mother left us when I was 6, running off with a contractor from Spokane, it was my grandfather who drove the 2 hours every weekend to pick me up so I wouldn't be alone while my father worked his way through the bottom of a bottle. Granddad taught me how to splice a line and how to read a depth chart before I was 12. He taught me the difference between a halyard and a sheet and why you never step over a coiled rope on a deck. On Sunday mornings, he made buckwheat pancakes with huckleberry syrup, the berries we'd picked together the summer before. And he let me pour the coffee even though he said I always made it too weak. When I was 15 and my father remarried a woman named Veronica who had a son my age named Marcus, Granddad was the one who sat me down on the end of the dock and said, "Claire, you're going to have to decide now whether you're going to be bitter or be better. You can't be both." I chose better, most of the time, but being better didn't mean being blind. Veronica was polished and careful and always kind in front of my father, and cutting and dismissive the moment he left the room. Marcus was the kind of boy who broke things and let me take the blame, and then grew into the kind of man who lost 2 businesses before he turned 30 and kept asking my father for loans he never paid back. Granddad saw all of it. He never said a word against them directly. He just watched. That was his way. Quiet, patient, assessing, like a pilot scanning instruments before a night landing. When I joined the Coast Guard after college, my father told me it was a waste of my business degree. Granddad drove 9 hours from Idaho to my commissioning ceremony in New London, Connecticut, sat in the front row in his old dress whites, and cried when I took the oath. Afterward, over a steak dinner, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "Claire, there are people in this family who love the idea of money more than they love the people it was meant for. When the time comes, I want you to remember that documents outlast charm." I thought he was being sentimental. He was on his 2nd Manhattan. I laughed and kissed him on the cheek and told him to stop talking like he was going to die any time soon. He just smiled and tapped the rim of his glass against mine. The last year of his life, I got up to the lake house every chance I could. My station was in Port Angeles, about a 6-hour drive if the roads were clear, and I made that drive maybe once a month. Granddad was slower by then. He used a cane he'd carved himself out of madrone wood, and he tired easily, but his mind was sharp as a hook knife. We'd sit on the deck in the evenings, and he'd ask me about my crew, about the rescues, about whether I was seeing anyone. I wasn't. I've never been good at that part of life. He'd nod and say, "Plenty of time." The last weekend I saw him alive, he walked me down to the dock and pointed at the boathouse. He said, "When I'm gone, you remember this place was built for family, not for people who think family is a transaction." I told him I'd remember. He squeezed my shoulder and said, "Read everything, Claire. Everything they put in front of you. Every page." I didn't think much of it at the time. He was an old Navy man. They talk like that. 2 weeks later, my father called at 5 in the morning to tell me Granddad was gone. The funeral was on a Thursday. I wore dress blues, and I was one of the pallbearers along with 3 of his old squadron mates who had flown in from Pensacola and San Diego. Veronica wore a black hat with a veil that I'm fairly sure she had bought specifically for the occasion. Marcus wore a suit that didn't fit him right across the shoulders. My father wept quietly in the second pew. The reception was at the lake house, and I remember walking through the kitchen and seeing Veronica already opening drawers, already counting silverware. I remember thinking, give it a week, at least. Give the man a week in the ground. We drove into Coeur d'Alene the next afternoon to meet with the attorney. His name was Walter Reeves, a man in his 60s with thick white eyebrows and an office that smelled like old paper and coffee. He read the first part of the will aloud in a calm, unhurried voice. The lake house and the surrounding 42 acres, he said, were to pass to my father, Harold Lindquist, along with the vintage 1967 Chris Craft Corsair that Granddad had restored over 12 winters in the boathouse. The investment accounts, roughly valued at $3.4 million, were also to go to my father. Veronica's hand squeezed my father's arm so hard I could see the white of her knuckles. Marcus actually laughed, then covered his mouth. I remember feeling the heat rise in my face, and then I remember feeling nothing at all. Mr. Reeves looked up over his glasses and asked if there were any questions. Veronica said quickly, No, that's perfectly clear, thank you so much." And she stood up. My father stood up too, slower, and finally I stood up. I waited. I waited for Mr. Reeves to say something else. To turn the page. He looked at me for a long moment, and I thought I saw something pass across his face, something like a question. But then Veronica was already at the door, herding my father out, and I walked out behind them feeling like I'd been punched in the solar plexus. That was the afternoon she told me I had until morning to be out of the guest house. The guest house where I had stayed every visit for 15 years, the guest house where Granddad had put a little brass plaque above the door that read, "Claire's Harbor." I didn't argue. I went up to the main house to pack the few things I kept there, a uniform bag, some civilian clothes, a framed photo of Granddad and me on the Corsair from when I was 7, my old copy of Bowditch's American Practical Navigator that he'd given me for high school graduation. I walked up the gravel path between the big house and the guest house, and the evening sun was slanting low through the cedars, and I could hear a loon somewhere out on the lake calling the way they do when a storm is coming. The guest house door was unlocked. The bed was still made from my last visit. My grandfather's reading chair sat by the window, a book of Frost poems still open on the armrest. I stood there for a long time. It wasn't the money. I want you to understand that. It was never the money. It was the speed. It was the fact that my father, the man who should have stood between me and his wife's ambitions, had stood aside. It was the fact that I could already hear Marcus in the main house, laughing about which room he was going to take. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. And then I remembered something Granddad had said on that last walk down to the dock. "Read everything, Claire. Every page." I sat up slowly. I zipped my bag. I did not cry. Marines cry and aviators cry, and Coast Guard officers cry, but not in other people's houses, not when those people are watching. I carried my bag down the gravel path, past the main house where the lights were all on and music was playing, and I loaded it into my truck. Veronica appeared on the front porch as I was closing the tailgate. She called out, "Oh, Claire, The locksmith is coming tomorrow at 10, just so you know." I didn't answer her. I just raised a hand. Military courtesy. The kind you give to someone whose rank you are required to respect but whose character you privately do not. I drove into town and took a room at a little motel off Sherman Avenue, the kind of place with pine paneling and a coffee maker that hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my service dress, and I looked at my phone. I had 6 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. When I checked the voicemail, it was Walter Reeves, the attorney. His voice was tight and formal. "Lieutenant Lindquist, I need you to call me back at your earliest convenience. There's a matter regarding your grandfather's estate that we did not have the opportunity to discuss this afternoon." I called him back immediately. It was almost 7 in the evening, but he picked up on the second ring. "Lieutenant," he said, "may I ask you a direct question? Did your father and his wife read the entire will before they left my office this afternoon?" I said I didn't know. I said they had stood up the moment he finished reading the part about the house and the accounts. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Walter Reeves said, very quietly, "I had a feeling that might be the case. Lieutenant, I would like you to come to my office tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Please do not tell your family. Your grandfather was very specific about that." I didn't sleep much that night. I lay on top of the motel comforter with my uniform jacket still on, watching the ceiling fan rotate, trying to figure out what Granddad had done. Because I knew, the way you know when a swell is about to break, that he had done something. I was at Walter Reeves's office at 8:45 the next morning. He let me in himself, locked the door behind me, and walked me back to a conference room where he laid out a thick file, 3 documents on top of it, and a small wooden box I recognized instantly. It was the cigar box Granddad had kept on the top shelf of his workshop since I was a child. He poured me a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. "Lieutenant," he said, "your grandfather came to see me about 14 months ago. He brought with him a physician's assessment of his mental competency, which I have on file. He wanted to make some changes to his will. He also wanted me to understand the reasons for those changes so that I could execute them exactly as he wished. May I tell you what he said?" I nodded. I couldn't find my voice. Mr. Reeves folded his hands on the table. "Your grandfather told me that his son, your father, had become a weaker man than he had hoped. He said that was partly his own fault, for not being harder on him as a boy. But he also said that he believed your father's wife had exerted a significant influence over him for many years, and that he did not trust her to act in your interest once he was gone. He told me he had watched her, and her son, for a long time. He told me he had been tested by them repeatedly in small ways over the course of many years." Mr. Reeves paused. "He told me he believed that when he died, they would move quickly, faster than grief would normally allow. And he told me that he wanted the will structured in such a way that their own actions would reveal them." I set the coffee down. My hand was shaking. "What did he do?" I asked. Mr. Reeves turned the top document toward me. "Your grandfather's estate was restructured into a revocable trust approximately 13 months ago. The assets you heard described yesterday, the house, the land, the boat, the investment accounts, are not owned by your father. They are owned by the Edward Lindquist Family Trust. Your father is listed as a successor beneficiary, but the trust contains a provision, which I did not read aloud yesterday, that shifts the primary beneficiary designation based on certain triggering events." I stared at him. "What triggering events?" He turned the second document toward me. I read the heading, Section 7, Conduct Clause. I read the first paragraph, and then I read it again because my eyes kept sliding off the words. The clause stated, in language so precise it could only have been written by a man who had spent his life in uniform, that if the successor beneficiary, meaning my father, or any member of his immediate household attempted to remove, exclude, or deny residence to his granddaughter, Claire Ann Lindquist, from any property held by the trust within 180 days of his death, the beneficiary designation would automatically shift. The primary beneficiary would become me. My father would retain only a life estate in a single cottage on the property, contingent on his spouse's removal from the household. Marcus was named nowhere. I looked up. Walter Reeves was watching me carefully. "Your grandfather left you a letter," he said, and he slid the cigar box across the table. The letter inside was written in Granddad's tight, careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had graded my navigation homework when I was in high school. "Claire," it began, "if Walter is giving you this, then the tide has come in the way I expected. Do not be angry at your father. He is not an evil man. He is a frightened one, and frightened men are easily led. But your stepmother is neither frightened nor evil. She is simply a woman who has spent 20 years calculating, and calculation without love is a dangerous thing in a family. I wanted to give them the chance to do right by you. I hoped they would. I prepared for the possibility that they would not. You have always had the clearest eyes of anyone in this family, kid. You see people as they are, not as they pretend to be. The lake house is yours now, if you want it. But it was never really about the house. It was about who you become when you are given power over people who hurt you. Your grandmother used to say that the measure of a person is what they do when nobody is watching and nothing is owed. You are being watched now. By me, in whatever form that watching takes. Stand steady. Granddad." I read it 3 times. I folded it carefully. I put it back in the cigar box. Walter Reeves pushed a tissue box across the table and I realized, belatedly, that I was crying. I don't cry in front of strangers. I hadn't cried at the funeral, but I cried in that office for about 4 minutes, while Walter Reeves pretended to read his own notes, and then I wiped my face and said, "What do I need to do?" He said, "I can have the county clerk issue the updated deed by Monday. I've already prepared the documentation. We simply need your signature and 2 witnesses." I signed everything, and when I walked out of that office at 10:15 on a Friday morning, I was the owner of the lake house, 42 acres of old-growth cedar, a 1967 Chris Craft, and a trust valued at roughly $3.6 million, with the authority to determine who was permitted to live on the property. I did not drive straight to the lake house. I drove back to Port Angeles. I went to work. I ran my crew through a cold water rescue drill on Monday. I filed my quarterly reports. I made arrangements with my CO for a 2-week leave of absence. I did not call my father. I did not respond to the single text message Veronica sent me on Sunday afternoon, which read, "Hope you found somewhere to land, honey," with a small winking emoji that I think was supposed to soften the malice. On the following Friday, 8 days after the will reading, I drove back to Coeur d'Alene. Walter Reeves met me in his office with the updated deed, the trust paperwork, and a letter of legal notice that he would be filing with the county by the end of the day. He asked if I wanted him to accompany me to the house. I said no. This was family business, and I wanted to do it face to face. He nodded and said, "Lieutenant, I'll be on my phone. If anything becomes difficult, you call me." I said I would. I drove out to the lake house with the folder on the passenger seat. The afternoon was cool and clear, and the cedars along the shore road were beginning to turn. When I came around the final bend in the driveway, I saw 3 cars parked by the main house. A black BMW I didn't recognize, Marcus's truck, and a catering van. Veronica was having a party. Of course she was. I parked behind the van and walked up the flagstone path. Through the tall windows I could see maybe 15 or 16 people in the great room, holding flutes of champagne. Veronica was at the center of them in a green silk dress, telling some story with her hands. My father stood near the fireplace, half listening. Marcus was on the deck with 2 other men, laughing. I rang the doorbell. One of the caterers answered. When she saw my uniform, her eyes widened. I said, "I need to speak with Mrs. Lindquist and Mr. Lindquist. I'll wait here." The caterer nodded and disappeared. A moment later, Veronica appeared in the entryway, and the smile on her face flickered and then reset itself into something harder. "Claire," she said, "this really isn't a good time." I said, "I'm afraid it is." My father came up behind her then, and I saw him register my service dress, the folder under my arm, the stillness in my face. He had been a military wife's son once before he married Veronica. Some part of him remembered what an officer looked like when she was delivering news. "Claire," he said, What's going on? I need 10 minutes, I said. Alone. Your guests can wait in the great room. Veronica started to protest, but my father, for the first time in maybe 15 years, held up a hand and silenced her. He said, Veronica, 10 minutes. She followed us into the study, my grandfather's old study, with the stuffed trout on the wall and the roll-top desk and the smell of pipe smoke still clinging faintly to the curtains. I closed the door. I set the folder on the desk. I opened it. And then I told them. I will not pretend I didn't take some satisfaction in watching Veronica's face as she read the contact clause. Her lips moved silently as she went through the paragraph a second time. My father sat down hard in the leather chair by the window. Marcus, who had pushed in from the deck uninvited when he heard voices, stood in the doorway with his mouth slightly open, still holding his champagne flute. Veronica recovered first. This is nonsense, she said. We'll contest it. I said, You're welcome to. Mr. Reeves has already filed the paperwork with the county. The deed is in my name as of this morning. There is also, in that folder, a copy of the physician's competency assessment from 14 months ago, along with notes from 3 subsequent meetings your father-in-law had with Mr. Reeves over the past year. Any competency challenge will fail. My father looked up at me slowly. Claire, he said, what do you want us to do? I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the man who had let his wife tell me to leave my grandfather's house less than 4 hours after the burial. I looked at him, and I thought about what Granddad had written. He is not an evil man. He is a frightened one. I said, Dad, I want you to ask your guests to leave. I want you to do it politely. I want you to tell them there has been a family matter. Then I want you and Veronica and Marcus to sit down at this desk and listen to what I am going to propose. Veronica's chin lifted. Propose, she said. You could just throw us out. The way we threw you out. I said, yes, I could. And I let that sit for a moment. I let her feel the shape of it. Then I said, but that isn't the kind of person my grandfather raised. We sat at that desk for almost 2 hours. I told them what I was going to do with the property. I had been thinking about it for a week, and I had talked it over with 2 of my old academy classmates who worked with veteran services organizations on the East Coast. I was going to keep the guest house for my own use when I visited. The boat house and the Chris Craft I was going to keep in the family. But I was going to register the boat with the Lake's Historical Society and allow it to be shown twice a year at the Classic Boat Festival in Sandpoint, the way Granddad used to do before his hands got too tired. The main house I was going to convert, over the next 18 months, into a small residential retreat for Coast Guard and Navy veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress, particularly those who had served in rescue and recovery roles. I had already spoken with a nonprofit director in Seattle who specialized in this kind of transition housing. The 42 acres would remain largely undeveloped, but the lower pasture would be converted into a community garden that residents could work in as part of their therapy. The foundation would be called the Easy Lindquist Foundation, after my grandfather's call sign. Veronica listened to all of this in silence. My father's eyes filled once, and he looked away. Marcus, to his credit, said nothing stupid, which was a significant act of restraint for him. When I finished, I said, There is a cottage at the south end of the property, 2 bedrooms. It was Granddad's caretaker cottage before he stopped needing one. Dad, under the terms of the trust, you have a life estate in that cottage. You can live there as long as you want. But there is a condition, and the condition is in Granddad's handwriting, not mine. My father said, What is it? I looked at Veronica. I said, The cottage is for you alone, Dad. Not for your wife, not for her son. That was Granddad's decision, not mine. I am telling you what the document says. Veronica stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. You cannot be serious. I said, I am entirely serious, however. I paused. The trust gives me discretion on this point. I have the authority to waive it. My father looked at me. Claire, I said, Dad, I will waive it on one condition. I need you to understand something. Not agree to it, understand it. You let her tell me to leave my grandfather's house the night of his funeral. You stood there while she did it. You let Marcus move into my room before my grandfather's body was cold. I am not asking for an apology. Apologies are cheap. I am asking you to understand that the next time she tells you to choose between her and me, your answer matters, not because of the will. The will is settled. I am asking because I am your daughter, and I have been your daughter for 29 years, and I would like you to act like it for whatever years we have left. My father put his face in his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. Veronica said, coldly, "Harold, we should leave." My father raised his head. He looked at her. And then he looked at me. And he said, very quietly, "Veronica, please wait outside." She stared at him. I don't think anyone had spoken to her in that tone in 20 years. She turned and walked out of the study. Marcus followed her after a moment. When the door closed, my father stood up and walked around the desk and put his arms around me. And for the first time since my grandmother died in 1984, I felt him cry on my shoulder. The work on the property began in the spring. We broke ground on the retreat center conversion in April, and the first 4 residents arrived in September of the following year. One of them was a retired Coast Guard boatswain's mate who had pulled drowned teenagers out of the surf off Cape Disappointment for 16 years. And he stood on the dock the first evening with his hands in his pockets and cried quietly while the sun went down over the lake. My father moved into the caretaker's cottage that October. Veronica, to nobody's surprise and only my mild sadness, filed for divorce 11 months after the will reading. Marcus moved to Boise, and last I heard was selling real estate badly. My father started coming up to the main house a few times a week to help with maintenance. He's good with engines like Granddad was. He helped rebuild the dock pilings last summer alongside 2 Navy vets who were staying at the retreat. On Sunday mornings now, I drive down from Port Angeles when I can, and my father makes buckwheat pancakes with huckleberry syrup, and he lets me pour the coffee even though he says I still make it too weak. Granddad's portrait hangs above the fireplace in the main house, and his dress whites, the way he stood at my commissioning. And every time I walk past it, I remember what he wrote in that letter. It was about who I would become when I was given power over people who hurt me. The greatest thing my grandfather left me was not the house or the boat or the trust. It was the quiet, careful certainty that character, in the end, is the only inheritance that cannot be contested. If this story reminded you of someone who taught you how to stand steady when the tide came in, I hope you'll think of them today. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome to stay a while and listen. Thank you for being here.